Hi, everyone. This is Clint 𝗏𝗏𝗏, and I'm here with Jim Scatena today, a legend in the creative industry. And Jim, thank you so much for being with us today and really excited to talk to you about your journey.
Hi, this is Clint 𝗏𝗏𝗏. Thanks for joining the Creative Retail Talks podcast today, where we will be discussing the latest in life, business, and retail.
So let's go back to the early days to start with, back before career and work and all of those things. Tell me kind of what were your early years? Where did you grow up, and what did you do before you started working?
Sure. Matter of fact, I had to clean up my office a little bit this morning to take down all the Pittsburgh Steelers memorabilia because I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And I'm still a diehard fan. One of the benefits of retirement is I've had season tickets for almost 40 years. So I still go back. It's about 500 miles, but I go back to every home game. But like I said, I was born in Western Pennsylvania. I'm not going to hide it. It was in 1951. And it was an amazing time for this country and an amazing time for my family. My family were immigrants from Italy. They came over in the teens, I think around 1917, and they settled in that Western Pennsylvania area because there were good jobs working in the coal mines. And if you know anything about that city, it's a blue collar, hardworking steel mill, coal mine kind of place. When I reflect back on my career, that's where a lot of my values came from. Everybody was equal. People worked hard. They helped each other. And those things as a young boy left indelible memories on me. I was with my sister this weekend. We were telling the story about, we were fortunate. My father, all of his brothers worked in the mine, but my dad was the youngest and he had the opportunity to go to the university and get a degree. And he ended up as a public servant in the county government. But we lived 15 or 20 miles from the county courthouse. And it seemed like a couple of times a week, somebody would stop by, knock on the door and say, his name was Tony, can you pick up my daughter's wedding license? Can you pick up my dog license while you're at the courthouse? Can you file these papers for me? And he would always say, sure, I'd be happy to do that for you. And then he'd come home that night and I'd run him over to the neighbor's house. And the next morning you would wake up and there'd be a basket of tomatoes or some homemade bread or some cookies that the neighbors exchanged as a thank you. And
wow,
you know, as a young person, I didn't quite understand that at first, but my parents quickly, taught me the lesson that you scratch each other's back, you take care of each other at whatever level you can afford to participate. So I grew up and had all my formal education there in Western Pennsylvania. And I graduated from the university in 1973. That was in the 1900s, 1970. And I do think I'm not special, but I do think I'm unique in that I have pretty much spent my entire career and most of my life in the industry.
Yeah.
So Western Pennsylvania is where it all started.
All right. Well, I am going to do a little caveat here. So for all my Cowboys fans, I'm still letting Jim be on the podcast, even though he's a Steelers fan.
I'll watch it anyway.
Hey, I remember some of those great years with Lynn Swann and Terry Bradshaw and those guys playing for the Steelers. And back when the Cowboys and Steelers played, they played quite a bit. Yeah, it was a great rivalry back then. Yeah, for sure. Well, that's a great upbringing, and I love the lessons you learned by watching your community. Sounds like a great place to grow up.
Yeah, it was. Still is.
Yeah. So what got you into the creative industry after school? Yeah,
it's kind of interesting. So I worked my way through college. I had some reasonable help, scholarship help, but there was always a little extra. And this is in the days when you graduated high school and your parents put their arm around you and they said, good luck, son, or you're on your own. So I went off to the university, and while I was in school, needing a little extra money, I went to work in retail, and I was working for J.C. Penney.
Yeah.
Just working nights and Saturdays selling clothing on commission to kind of, get my way through school.
Yeah.
And I had a mentor, and that's another thing I want to emphasize today, that my life has been blessed, but there have been 3 or 4 people along the way who just pushed me along, sometimes pushed me harder. And he encouraged me, because I showed some promise, to enroll in their management training program. And so I was pretty much guaranteed, because I worked, I think, 3 years during college, that when I graduated, I could go right into the buyer's training program in New York and have a career in retail. And I enjoyed it. And I enjoyed retail, and I still do to this day. And I have great respect for people who work at retail, because it's an important, tough job with long hours on your feet.
Yes.
But about that time, there was a little company, a little family-owned business in Chicago, started by a man named Norman Wilton. Norman was a baker, and he was quite good at it, and he was quite artistic. And he used great quantities of baking and decorating supplies. And he struck out on his own and went to Asia, but not the Asia we know. He went to Japan and Korea and started to source cake decorating products that not only he could use, but he saw the opportunity to sell it to other bakeries. So he started a company called Wilton Enterprises. And about the time that I was moving along in my career, some of the thought leaders at Wilton said, we make these really interesting pans. They're not just squares or rectangulars or round, but we can make cakes, pans in the shape of Mickey Mouse or Holly Hobbie or Winnie the Pooh or Snoopy the dog. And so they found the technology to shape bakeware, and they caught the attention of a store manager, a JCPenney store manager in the St. Louis area. And his wife happened to be a hobbyist and a cake decorator. He said, I think we could sell those pans in our store. So he reached out to the company, and it's exactly at the same time that I was coming through the management training program. And management, the family business had just been sold to a Chicago entrepreneur named Vince Nacarado. And Vince had big dreams for the company. And what they did was they didn't have packaging, they didn't have labeling. So they did artwork and hand cut every shaped pan, put labels in them, and took them down to St. Louis and did an unofficial test. And through a lot of circumstances, they reached out to me because of my experience at JCPenney and said, help us grow into this account. And I remember going to a meeting where the district managers said, we're going to go ahead and try this. And we're not going to tell anybody in New York. Because if it fails, we might get fired. But if it succeeds, the boys in New York will take all the credit for it. So we literally handmade some cake decorating pans and instructions and things like that, put them in 7 stores in St. Louis, and the rest is history.
Wow.
At one point in time when JCPenney was a dominant resource in the housewares space, we became a significant new supplier to them.
Yeah. So Wilton actually launched at JCPenney. I did not realize that.
Yeah. And for many, many years, JCPenney was our #1 customer, because in my era, back in the 70s, there wasn't an abundance of craft stores around.
Right.
And we can talk about the history sometime. I've been in all of them, but our top 3 customers in my first 5 years were JCPenney, Montgomery Ward, and Sears and Roebuck.
Yeah.
And we sold in the housewares department with baking supplies. Made sense.
Yeah, that does. So that was back in the day when department stores were big and the thing, right?
Right. So, where the history kind of overlaps with craft industry, there was an old chain of franchise stores called Ben Franklin. And there's only a few of us veterans around who remember Ben Franklin, especially in their heyday. And a buyer at Ben Franklin saw this cake decorating activity going on, And he said, this is more of a craft than it is cooking. And he said, I think Ben Franklin, because we're out in small town America where people like to bake and cook and things like that, I think we can make this a category. And that gentleman's name was Casey Casebolt. Casey's spent his entire career in the craft industry too, and retired a number of years ago back for Gerson. But Casey pitched it to his management at the district level. And we were approached by Ben Franklin to develop a craft program. We didn't even know what the craft business was. And so Ben Franklin put us in. I remember, I think the very first store was in Hutchinson, Kansas. And the program just resonated with the Ben Franklin consumer, and especially the craft consumer. And that was our entree into the craft industry. And I'm going to go backwards and forwards here for a second. The success in those days with Ben Franklin was largely because once a year they would have an annual meeting, a convention of all of their store owners, and it was their own trade show, Ben Franklin show. And you literally got to talk face to face with people who had their skin in the game. They had bought a franchise, and you couldn't just say this is a great program and then have to face them again next year when they invested their money in it. It didn't work.
Yeah.
We worked hand in hand, face to face with mom and pop Ben Franklin store owners, some of which had multiple stores. Back in those days, 10 stores, you were a big gun with Ben Franklin. And we built a multi-million-dollar business with Ben Franklin.
Yeah.
And as you know, success breeds success. We caught the attention of other retailers around the country. And again, these are old names that probably half the people that hear this podcast won't remember. But there was a craft chain in Chicago, actually Elgin, Illinois, called Lee Ward's. And they were probably at the time the biggest, or certainly the chain with the most stores dedicated to crafting. And, you know, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So they imitated what Ben Franklin was doing. And the next thing you know, we were knee deep in the craft industry. And from there, you know, Wilton became a legend. And, you know, there's a lesson there that, again, I hope particularly our younger industry veterans know that story, because the reason that company, well, you know, there was a certain amount of public company there, so I'm not telling any secrets. But when I joined the Wilton company, when Mr. Wilton owned it, they were doing annual revenue of about $6 million, which in the 70s was not bad for a.
Yeah.
Well, all I can say is when, and it's public information, when they sold that company 40 years later, they sold it for almost $700 million.
Yeah.
Wilton became a huge category, always in the top three, with both mom and pop and chain stores. But the secret to success was the direct connection to the consumer. We taught cake decorating classes, and I left the company in '97. We were teaching over 250,000 students a year in Michael's and Lee Ward's and Hobby Lobby and Joann's and anybody that could put a classroom in their store. And once we interacted with those consumers and showed them they could be successful, it became a multi-$100 million business.
Yeah, that's amazing. What a great story. And you're right, a great lesson. I do think sometimes in the industry, we get so focused on selling to the retailer that we don't always have the proper focus on the end consumer. And I've seen lots of companies like you have, where when the right focus is put on the end consumer, the rest of it takes care of itself. And it sounds like that was definitely the case with Wilton.
Yeah, it was. And, you know, again, to fast forward now, one of the things that I love so much about the industry today is the focus on digital content creators and influencers and designers. You know, those were people, and with all due respect, they were somewhere down the ladder of importance to a lot of people.
Yeah.
You know, in my early days, the manufacturers had the power, right? We called the shots and we ran the advertising and we described the pricing structures and things like that. And then as the chain stores came along, the power shifted to the retail side, from the supplier side to the seller side, and they had all the cards. And so they dictated the pricing and the marketing and things like that. But in the last, I don't know, 8 or 9 years, and especially recently, the consumer became king. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. I saw some research the other day about digital content creators that said the consumer is 7 times more likely to buy a product recommended by an average person than they are from a big brand, a Procter and Gamble or something like that. Because the issue of genuine, they'd rather buy it based on a comment from a woman in South Dakota that they never met than a billion-dollar corporation running advertising campaigns.
Interesting.
And to me, I say power to the digital content creators that you
absolutely
are growing this industry for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about that. 7 times more likely. That's huge.
Yep.
Definitely shows the power of that content and those recommendations, those organic recommendations, especially.
It's funny, like just a couple of years ago, I needed to buy a new washer and dryer for the house. And I had no idea, I barely know how to operate the thing. But I thought for a second, I started to read literature. And I went on and started looking at YouTube videos and talking to housewives and housekeepers like me, who said, this is how it works, and this is where it breaks, and this is what's noisy, and this is what's quiet. And and my brand based on that lady in Iowa who told me, you got to get this washer.
Right. And I heard a stat recently also, I think this is still the case, I'd have to verify this, but that YouTube has become the biggest search engine on the internet because of that, because you can literally go search for anything you need, want to learn, want to figure out. And I think for many of us, that's become the go-to when we need to figure something out. So, or get a recommendation. So yeah, absolutely.
Industry has benefited by that technology.
Yes, definitely. And I love seeing our industry really begin to adopt the technology and adopt the digital content creators and influencers and that kind of thing. It's been fun to see that progress to the point where even as I'm talking to people now, I was talking to Alexa Westerfield in an episode a few months ago. Alexa's great and a social media genius. And I asked her jokingly in that interview what she thought about TikTok for the craft industry. And she said, Clint, TikTok is becoming one of the greatest social media platforms for the craft industry and will continue to do that. And I also talked to Kathy Cano Murillo, and she was telling me the same thing, that, initially the view was TikTok is just for kids and teens, and that it's really emerging as a major platform for retail and for influencers.
Yeah. That one shocked me. I didn't see that one come. When I first
know.
Saw it, I was like, oh wow, this is a little out of my realm. And there were a couple of crazes, like some cooking crazes and things like that, where kids, made up a meal and things like that. And then I heard the numbers of how the sales of spaghetti sauce in a jar went up, and certain kinds of cheese and things like that. And they're boom, boom, boom. I love that. I really love that story. I do have one concern. And it's I always turn negatives into positives. It's not sticky, it hits and then it's gone.
Right.
It's up to us to, when we see the sticky ones, to jump on them and keep shoveling, because I'm from Pittsburgh, coal on fire and keep that fire burning. Don't just let TikTok give you a 30-day wonder, because they're very short. Think about the average teenager's attention span.
Right.
But they like to fire for us, and then it's up to us to keep it going.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's got to continue beyond where it flares up.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, great point.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation on the Creative Retail Talks podcast today. Be sure to visit our show notes page for more information on today's show. And if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, reach out to me at clint@creativeretailtalks.com. Creative Retail Talks is all one word. That email address will also be in the show notes. Hope you have a great day.